Let me tell you something before we continue. I did not have any grand plan. I just had that notebook on the table and a mind that would not rest. I did not open it the night Mama slid it across to me, and I did not sleep either. I lay there listening to the house settle and my daddy's chair creak on the porch, thinking about paper and how a thin page can weigh more than a sack of feed. Before daylight, I was up. I did not wake your great-grandparents. I took the notebook and slipped out, believing my grandmother's voice was still in it, and that somewhere in those pages was the very way she had saved that land before. I headed for the old tobacco barn that sat uphill from Granny's house, where the red clay thinned and gave way to stonier ground. Up there, the land looked like it had decided anything that grew would have to work harder for it. Granny used to say Daddy Bost built that barn on that slope because he trusted stubborn ground more than soft ground. She said the only thing harder than his head was that hill. It was also a good place for a tobacco barn. Back when tobacco was the crop that brought in the most cash, when it came in at all, the barn had been built for tobacco, not horses, and it still looked that way. My grandfather raised it out of hand-hewn pine, tall and square, with gray boards and narrow slats for air. The walls went higher than a stock barn needed to, and the tier poles still ran overhead in rows where tobacco had once hung to cure. Some of those poles were darkened from old smoke. There was no true loft, only the tiers above and a few rough planks laid across them here and there, enough to set things out of sight if a person had reason to. The frame had settled some with age, but it was sound. One door had dropped on its hinges and never shut all the way, so each morning a thin line of light came through and lay across the floor. It did not smell like a horse barn, except when Backlash was in it. He stayed out in the pasture most of the time. I only brought him in to saddle, brush down, or get him under cover when I needed to. The deeper smell of the place was older than him. Dry leaf, old smoke worked into the wood, iron, dust, and weather. My grandfather built it for curing tobacco. My grandmother found it served just as well for work. People did not talk much about. By the time it came to me, the barn had held its tongue for years. I led Backlash inside and slipped off his bridle, letting him stand easy by the rail near the wall. He knew the routine. There were no stalls, only the open floor and the poles above, with a little shed room off to the side for tack, tools, and feed. He lowered his head while I rubbed him down, and dust moved in the slant of light when he shifted his weight. Somewhere overhead, a board gave a dry little pop as the day warmed. That old barn had a way of settling a body. Standing there with him, breathing slow beside me, I felt steadier than I had a minute before. Outside, down toward the branch, I could hear the water moving faint and steady. Somewhere farther off, a woodpecker hit the side of an oak, with the same patient rhythm it would use whether I was listening or not. I gave Backlash a flake of hay, set it by the rail, and went for the ladder. It stayed against the wall beneath the tier poles, out of the way until somebody needed it. There was no loft in the barn, only the tiers overhead and a few rough planks laid across them. Still, folks called it going up. My boots found the rungs by habit, though I had not climbed there in years. The wood creaked lightly under me but held. After Granddaddy died suddenly, Granny kept feed and scraps up there for a time. Later it held tools. Later still it held things nobody named aloud. When a family is trying to get by, a barn can learn silence as surely as people do. I knelt on one of the planks near the far wall and pulled back a canvas tarp weighted with a coil of rope. Copper caught the light first, not the polished sort folks hang up for decoration, working copper. A coil of tubing lay folded into itself, dull with age, but still sound. Beside it sat a broad-bottomed kettle, blackened and scarred from flame. A length of pipe rested next to 3 wooden barrels, all different sizes, all turned upside down. Their hoops rusted dark as dried blood. There was nothing fine about it and nothing wicked either. It looked like what it was, tools set aside until needed. I held my hand above the copper without touching it. A faint coolness rose from it. I smiled a little, thinking that metal had known fire long before I knew the world. Then the stories came back, the ones Mama and Granny told on summer nights when heat loosened a person's tongue. They never told them proudly and never shamefully. They told them like sums worked out on paper, plain facts with hunger behind them. In 1908, when North Carolina went dry, your great-grandmother Lula Mae Bost was widowed young and left with 3 daughters who needed shoes and bread and a roof that did not leak. The farm's corn and small cotton did not produce enough cash to keep up with expenses. The tax bill did not shrink because a man had died. Hunger did not consult the preacher before arriving, so copper got set over flame, mash got stirred, and jars got filled and moved quiet through woods that knew how to keep their own counsel. I stood there with that pile calling up at me, and I will not lie to you, I hesitated. I thought about my daddy's calm voice at the table. He did not love that land the way Mama did, and not like Lula Mae had. To him it was mostly trouble, always needing something and never giving enough back. But he had never let it go outright either. I reckon there is a difference in a man's mind between letting a thing slide and being the one to hand it over clean. I thought about what it meant to become the kind of woman who made a decision like this and did not flinch afterward. Then the floor creaked under my shift of weight, and it sounded like the barn itself was ready to take my burden if I would just hand it over. I touched the coil at last, solid and cold. It felt like something that had been waiting, not on me exactly, but on a Caldwell girl with Bost blood in her veins to decide whether she believed she could stand against a world that kept its accounts so clean. That is when I opened the notebook. Tucked between 2 of Lula Mae's pages was an old invoice from Mast's General Store, and on the back of it she had written a set of instructions that read, like a recipe if you did not understand what you were looking at. Mama never called it a recipe. Mama called it a way through. I went back down that ladder and out of the barn, and I did not tell anybody where I was going because there was nobody there to tell. I hitched the wagon behind Backlash and rode into town like I was doing an ordinary errand. Ordinary is the best disguise you can wear in a small place. I bought sacks of cornmeal, a bag of sugar, and yeast tucked in among other goods like it belonged to biscuit dough and nothing more. I did not rush, and I did not linger. Men leaned against barrels outside the general store and talked low about crops and the sheriff's temper, and I kept my face open and unremarkable. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked what a young woman intended to do with 50 pounds of cornmeal beyond feed or bread. That night I worked in the barn by lantern light. At home I had already given a story about helping with a babysitting job for Eli's older sister, because in our world you always needed a story ready. Lantern glow cast long shadows along the boards, turning knots in the wood into eyes that seemed to watch and judge. I filled the smallest barrel halfway with water drawn from above the bend in the branch, where it ran clear and quick. I stirred and cracked corn until my shoulders ached, and the paddle dragged heavy through the thickening mash. Sugar went in next, and dissolved slow. Yeast last, sprinkled and folded with care like seed, meant for spring planting. The smell rose sweet and raw, promising something that did not exist yet. Then I sealed the barrel and waited, just as Lula Mae's note said. She had a line in the margin that read, "Waiting is the part nobody tells when they tell you about moonshine. They talk about the run and the jars and the money. They do not talk about the long stretch of hours where you keep checking a barrel like it is a restless animal that might bolt if you do not watch it." The surface foamed faint after a day, a quiet sign of life. I leaned close once and inhaled the sharp rising scent, unpleasant in itself, but full of change. Every hour felt counted against the number that kept running through my head. When the mash was ready, I assembled the still with steady hands. The copper fitted into place, with a familiarity that surprised me, like the stories had carried muscle memory down the line. I set the kettle over a bed of coals banked low and even, feeding the fire slow, watching the flame the way you watch a horse's temper. Too hot, and you scorch it. Too cool, and nothing moves at all. Lula Mae had another note there, written smaller than the rest, that if you ever try to run more than a little, you best get out of a barn. Fire was always the first danger. The first thin thread of clear liquid that came through the coil and fell into the waiting jar felt like a dare answered. The barn filled with heat and the smell of grain and something sharper underneath it. Sweat gathered at my temple. I wiped it with the back of my wrist and adjusted the fire again, never letting my eyes leave the drip for long. I poured off the first harsh measure, the way Lula May's instructions said. I kept my hands steady as I started to believe I could do this. When it was done, I lined the jars along a plank, set across 2 feed bins, and counted them. It was not a bounty, it was the beginning. At dusk, about a week later, I wrapped 2 jars in burlap and rode out halfway to Concord to meet a man I knew would buy without asking too many questions. He was not a friend. He had introduced himself once as somebody who knew Lula May's work and had paid her fair enough, back when women selling liquor was rare indeed. His porch light burned low when I approached, and he met me at the edge of the yard, instead of inviting me up to the steps. He weighed 1 jar in his hand, uncorked it, sniffed, and nodded. He offered $7 for the pair. I had expected more. My back and arms argued for more. The risk argued for more. But I did not have leverage yet, and the first rule of a new life is you do not pretend you are powerful before you are. I took the money and rode home under a sky that had gone from orange and violet to ink while I was not looking. The bills in my pocket felt light against the number in my head. I said something out loud to the sky that night, something I would not have said in front of Mama or Daddy. I said I was going to save what Granny had saved when Mama was a girl. I said it like a vow, and I believed myself when I said it. 2 days later, a rumor reached me after church. A man in Concord had taken ill, and folks were saying it was likely bad liquor. The man was a heavy drinker. His wife was angry and loud about it, and when an angry woman wants a name, she will pull one out of the air if she cannot find the right one. Nobody named me. Nobody named a maker. But the story moved like flames through dry grass, and by the time it reached me at the church steps, it had acquired the weight of certainty without the benefit of proof. That is how it works, baby. People love certainty. Proof takes too long. After supper that night, I stood by the pump behind the house when Mama mentioned it, her voice low as if the words themselves might bruise. She said they were calling it poison. My stomach turned so hard I thought the meat and potatoes might come back up. Poison? How could that be? I went back through every step in my mind, frantic and sharp, like I could rewind time by thinking hard enough. I had watched the fire. I had poured off the first run like the instructions said. I had done it careful. But fear does not care about your care. Fear only cares that you might have hurt somebody. If nobody bought from me, Granny's land would be lost for sure. If a man died because of my hands, I did not know how I would live in my own skin again. The next week, word came that what remained in the bottle would be sent to a chemist in Chapel Hill for testing. I had never seen Chapel Hill before. I had not been much farther east than Stanley County. I remember Daddy describing it like a place of brick buildings and young men with ink-stained fingers who believed in formulas as firmly as preachers believed in scripture. The idea that something I made in a dark barn would be studied under bright laboratory light felt humiliating and terrifying all at once. Days passed without news. The second barrel finished fermenting and waited above in the tiers. I did not light the fire. I would not add more jars to a rumor. I got up before dawn and worked in the fields with Daddy like nothing had shifted, though the weight of unspoken calculation sat in my limbs. If he suspected anything, he did not show it. Mama watched me closer than before and did not say a word. At night I lay awake, listening to the house settle, and the night birds call, replaying the run in my mind, each adjustment of heat, each jar filled. I had not cut corners. I had not rushed. Still, the thought that I might have misjudged something small and fatal pressed against my ribs until breathing felt like work, and swallowing felt like labor too. Then one afternoon, a week later, Mama came inside with a smile so bright it startled me. She had been grocery shopping, and when I asked what had her looking that way, she set the flour on the table, closed the screen door softly, and looked at me like she was making sure I was still there. Then she took my wrist and walked me into the pantry, where it smelled like dry beans and dust. She leaned close and dropped her voice. "It came back from Chapel Hill," she said. I started to ask how, and she shook her head. It went to Mrs. Parker. They sent it to the wife. On account of she signed for the samples. Her sister told me Thelma opened that letter, went pale, and then went straight to the doctor. From there it walked its own self across town. Mama's mouth tightened, then eased. She said it was clean. They had run the proof on it and checked it for the wood alcohols. Folks' worry can turn a man blind. Nothing like that in it. Just strong, the way it was supposed to be. Like Lula May made. Then she added, because she could not help herself, that the chemist had written a note at the bottom, saying if they could send him 5 more gallons, he could do more testing. Mama let out a breath that was almost a laugh and said even Chapel Hill had a sense of humor. Then she leaned in again, quieter, like this part mattered more. It turned out Mr. Parker had been up in Rowan County to one of those fish camps. Next day he was sick as a dog. The doctor called it food poisoning, probably from catfish. Mama's eyes flicked toward the pantry door, like Mrs. Parker might hear through walls. But Mrs. Parker was still out there blaming bootleggers anyway, telling anybody who would listen they had about killed her husband, even when the truth was plain as day. Some people just need a name to spit when they get scared of knowing better. Relief in our house was never loud. It showed itself in the way Mama's shoulders eased as she told me the story. Later, it showed in the way Daddy did not ask further questions. I honestly think he knew what I was doing, but how would that look for a deacon in the Methodist Church? Before supper, I walked back up to the barn. I climbed that rise with the certainty of somebody returning to unfinished work, not to temptation. The second barrel had been waiting, mash turned and ready, quiet on the surface but alive underneath. The copper pieces lay where I had left them, dull and patient, and they did not look accusatory anymore. When I assembled the still that time, my hands did not tremble. I banked the coals low and even and fed the fire carefully. The first thin thread of clear liquor formed and fell into the waiting jar, and it carried no triumph, only confirmation. Slowly, drop by drop, I found my rhythm again. Flame, copper, cooling, drip. I did not rush that run, and I did not linger either. I had complete faith in Lula May's instructions by then, and my worry over the lean began to seep back into my thoughts. Sweat gathered at the nape of my neck, and I set my mind to doing what needed to be done. My arms burned from lifting and steadying. My back ached from that long bend of work, but the ache felt proportional now, like effort and outcome had finally agreed on their terms. Outside, the sycamore shed another pale curl of bark that drifted down and settled in the grass by the branch. I was relieved, but there was no announcement of approval. There was no sign saying I was going too far or not far enough. Time simply remained steady, holding its shape the way it always had. It did not care whether I kept on or stopped. When I finished, I lined the jars along the plank and counted them once, then again, not because I doubted the number, but because I wanted it fixed in my mind with the same clarity as the figure on that notice. I knew there were $642.18 still standing between me and Granny's homestead. Like time, that amount was unchanged by relief or rumor, but it no longer felt like an accusation. It felt like distance, and distance, if you measure it right, can be crossed.